So now you've got the basic understanding of cells as the building blocks of web pages, and that there's a lot of flexibility to the cells, and that we create the cells through the use of defining HTML elements with code. The next thing that I want to talk about is that the use of columns and rows. So cells can be combined into a series of columns which go across the page and rows which go down the page. And what they allow us to do, if you think about this section here as your page, what the grid view of columns and rows allows us to do is to start to manipulate that space that we have, whether it be on our device, our tablet, or laptop, or desktop, or an image thrown up on a wall somewhere. Whatever you're using, the grid becomes the tool that you use that gives you the flexibility to manipulate the different cells, the elements that are in the page. And so we use that grid to develop pages. So just as an example of this, I'm going to go to a one-column page here. And what I've got, I mean, this is obviously a spreadsheet. If you think of this section here, that could be a page. I've got obviously other information in here. Let's touch on that information. Columns are the most important thing to understand at this point because they are what allow us to do layout. You have to define the width of a column or it's going to default to all of the available space for that column. The rows, on the other hand, will flex to fit the columns. And I think I can show you here. Before I do this, I'm going to just touch on what I've done over the next series of slides is I'm using a 960 pixel based grid in order to illustrate the purposes that we've got going forward here. And so in this case, I've got one column, and the width in pixels is 960. Let me go ahead and expand that so that you can see what that would look like. And you'll see that as I'm expanding, it tells me how many pixels I'm using. So I want to go to 960 pixels. So this is what my page would look like. And so you'll notice that when I did that, as I broadened that single column out, because this is our page, the rest of it's just support information, this would be our page. And so what you'll notice is that, for instance, this the words up here have adjusted to fit within the space of that column. So if we undo what we've done there, we're back to the words are more tightly wrapped, and the size of the cell has expanded to hold the contents that are in there. It doesn't automatically do that in spreadsheets, but in web pages it is going to expand unless you've assigned rules. Otherwise, each cell is going to expand to the height that's necessary for the content that's in there, but you have to define the grids. So let's go back to the 960. And the reason that I'm using 960 is because 960 pixels, and normally in a traditional way of doing web page layout, you use pixels. Now that's moving on to EMs as we get to flexible grids and fluid grids. We'll talk about that later on, but we'll use pixels for now just to help us understand. So a pixel is a single point on a screen or in print, but we're only talking about screen here. A single point where color can be assigned to a page. The reason we're using 960 is because it's one of those magic numbers. If you take and divide 960 by the lower integers, what you're going to find, and we'll only go through 16, is that 960 is divisible evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's not divisible evenly by 7. It is divisible evenly by 8, 10, 12, 15, and 16. So if you're designing a grid for a web page, if you use 960 pixels as a starting point, that allows you to figure out how wide each of the columns need to be. So let's go into that. So if we've just got the single column, and before I go on, what I've done here, just if you wanted to build this for yourself, I've put the number 960 there. I've put the number of cells or columns that I want to work with here, and over here I simply did an equation to divide 960 by whatever the property is there, and that's where I came up with these numbers. So let's explore some of them. So this particular page has one column and it's 960 pixels, and so essentially this would be what your page would look like. It would always look like this. If we switch to two columns, you'll notice that going back to this equation here, you would expect for two columns to be divisible by 960. You would expect each of those columns to be 480 pixels wide. So you can see how in this next grid, if this were my web page, you'd have two columns. Each of them would be 480 pixels. And what I've done here is just I've done a sum of these two together. And you'll notice that that's a format that I'm going to use over the next series of these, because what I'm trying to help you do is to understand that there's a mathematical relationship that goes on between all of these. It is actually very simple, and you can use a spreadsheet kind of like the one that I've set up here if you ever need to try and figure out what the math needs to be. So here I've got two columns, 480 pixels each. When I go to 4, then all of a sudden each column is 240 pixels, and that adds up to 960. 8, the size cuts down to 120. 12 columns, it cuts down to 80 pixels in each column. And in 16, that cuts down to 60. So 60 times 900, or 16 times 60 is 960, and you can see that back in our mathematical equation, 16 times 60 adds up to that 960. So that's the basis of using the 960 pixel grid system, and that's what it's called. It's called the 960 pixel grid system because it builds a lot of flexibility into the way that we design web pages. But if you know anything about design, one of the things that you want to avoid is having your columns butt up against each other. So if I went back to this and say I had these both the same background color, and I'm just going to change the background color here, you'll notice that these things butt right up next to each other. If these were filled with text, you would notice that you can't really see clearly when one ends and the next begins. So there's space that needs to be in there. And within the print industry and within the web industry, what we do is we call those that space that needs to be in there, because it's a visual need for humans to have that space between those columns. So what we do is we use gutters, and this system allows us to do this. And I realize this looks complicated at first, but it'll make more sense as we go forward. So what we've done is we've taken the same 960 grid system, and we've taken, so there's your columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc., etc., etc. And so we've got the 16 columns that are still here. But what we've done in this model is we have added these rows that are or these columns that will serve as gutters. And so when I go in here, what I'm doing is I'm taking that same column, so taking column 1, and what I'm doing in order to get those gutters is I'm taking 10 pixels off of the left and off of the right of column 1. I'm also taking 10 pixels off of the left of column 2, so off the left and the right. And what that does is it brings it so that here's column 1, and on this side, let me spread this out a little bit more. So what you're seeing here is here's column 1, 40 pixels, and the reason it's 40 whereas before it was 60 is I'm taking 10 off here and I'm taking 10 off here. So if I were to do the math, and that's what this is for over here, this is giving me the sum of these three columns. So what it's doing is it's saying for one column, and you can see it visually there, it's going to add those together. 10 plus 10 plus 40 equals that original 60, which if we go back to it, you'll notice that it was 60 pixels. So what I'm doing is I'm borrowing 10 pixels from each side of that column in order to create the gutters. Now what I've done here, and you might want to do this because this is a really useful tool, go through and set up this top part of the spreadsheet that I've got here, and you've got the 960 pixels. So format this out so that you can do 40 pixels, and this, by the way, is a 16 column layout that I'm doing here. Go ahead and create your gutter and your column. So you've got a gutter, column, gutter, and you'll notice there's a double gutter. That's because I'm using 10 pixels from the left and the right. Over on the edges, only 10 pixels come into play. In the middle, 20 pixels come into play. Now you can change those number of pixels when you get into designing, but for the purpose of understanding this grid system, you're going to continue to do this. So this column number 2 has the 40 pixels in the middle, 10 and 10. And you do that the whole way across. And what this does, if you go ahead and work these equations over here, so that in this case, if I look at this equation, you'll notice that it's grabbing, let me undo that, it just grabbed all of them. It's grabbing these sections right here. So what that's going to tell me is that if I want a 2-column section with the gutters, then it's going to need to be 120. Okay, and you can do that the whole way out, and it's going to explain to you that exactly how many pixels you would need to do. If you were doing a 1-column layout, you'd need to have 60 pixels divided into 3 columns, 10, 40, and 10. So that should explain the beginning of the grid. Now let me go ahead and move this to the next. I want to format this so that it's actually in the 960 pixel range. And you lose the numbers here. They're still in these cells, but because I've narrowed each row down, so row B is 10 pixels wide. Same thing with all the rest of the gutters. So I've set the columns at the width of 40 pixels. Actually, let me go ahead and set this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab all the columns here, and I'm just doing a control click. I'm doing this on a PC, and I'm grabbing each of the columns, and I want to set them all to 40 pixels because I noticed that they're not at 40 pixels right now. So I'm going to set these all at 40 pixels so that you can see what it actually looks like in this page. So it's at 35, change it to 40, and I've already changed the gutters in the same way. So this becomes my web page, so that this gives me a visual of the columns and the gutters for the entire web page, and this tells you how wide it needs to be. So I've colorized this so that this section here, and that's the number of pixels that are due there. So if I wanted to have a 8-pixel wide section, and you'll notice I have this sectioned up into 2 8-pixel wide section, or 8-column wide sections. Those 8 columns and the gutter, if I want to have those, so if I wanted to split this page in half into a 2-column, what I would do is I would come to the section that represents those 8 columns, which is right there, and then you would see that each of those would be 480. You see how that works? So this becomes a tool that you can use to calculate. If I wanted something to be 15 columns wide and I was using a 16-column grid, then it would need to be 900 pixels wide, leaving that extra 60 pixels, a gutter on the edge, a column, a gutter on the inside. And so that is the raw numbers of how this is going to work. Now, actually, and we'll get into this in another lesson, normally you're going to leave a gutter on the outside, on the left and the right of the page. So it in essence becomes 940 pixels that you're working with because you're leaving those grids. But that's something that we'll conquer later on in another lesson. The goal here is to give you an idea of how you would say you were wanting to decide, I was doing a 2-column header. So that gives you the numbers that you're working with there. So here I've used the gutters. I took off the gutters there and there. So that was 480 minus the 10 pixels on each side, and that leaves me with 460. So if I were doing this strictly by the book, I would have 2 columns at 460 each, and then I would have a gutter on each end of 10 pixels, and in between them there would be a gutter of 20 pixels because I've taken 10 pixels off of each of those. And if you add all those up together, it comes to 960. You have to add the gutters and the columns all together to get that. So if I was turning this into a web page, this is what I would end up doing. So this is the 2-column section, and so this is the 460, and this is 460, and you'll notice that I've merged the cells there to actually create 2 cells, and that's what you're doing when you're defining a width. Is you're saying, I want this to be, this 1 column to be, or this 1 cell to be the equivalent of 8 columns. These are the numbers that I need to do, and it'll make more sense as you use this tool. Now you'll notice that over here I added in a section for navigation, and what I did is I left the outside gutter and I used the 2 columns and the 2 center gutters, and I came up with 100 pixels. And the way that I did this, again, I've got the equation there. So I said I'm going to go from B2 to E2, and that's how big that column is going to become. That's 100 pixels, because we've got 10 pixels on each side that were taken for the gutter. So it would normally have been 120, but because we're adding the gutters, that comes down to 100. I realize this is kind of hard to understand by just watching. So what you should do now is you should go and either create a 12-column or a 16-column spreadsheet like what I'm using here, and then go through and add the different sizes, add the gutters like we did in the 16. You can do this for, really you could do it for the 1, 2, 4, 8, any one of them. So for instance, if I was doing the 1 column, I would still need to add the gutters. So what you should do is you should go in and create either the 12 column or the 16 column and create the spreadsheet, add the gutters, make sure you put the pixel widths in here, and go ahead and do the equations so that you can do this, and then create just a basic layout in here so that you can start understanding how the numbers work and how this idea of a 960 pixel grid allows you to have the flexibility and know what size, for instance, this image should be, or how wide this is going to be, because it becomes important later on. As we go to a fluid grid later on, then what you introduce a mathematical equation that will switch from pixels to percentages, but that's an advanced thing. We'll worry about that later on. But understanding this 960 pixel grid system is a foundation to really understanding this. And if you want to understand it even further and see templates, for instance, for Photoshop or InDesign, there's a place where you can go to get this, because I didn't create this information. And what it's called is the 960 grid system. So if you go to 960.gs, there's a lot of resources here. This is a site that has put out a lot of information about this grid system, how it works, gives you examples of how people are doing it, and gives you different templates that you can use for different programs, so that when you start designing this, that you can use those templates. And so that's what you should do for today. That will give you the foundational understanding of how we do layout for the grid. as we move forward, one of the things that you're going to learn is that the reason that we don't lay out web pages in spreadsheets is because they aren't flexible. They're fixed in here. So while it's a good design tool for us to design it, it's not a good tool for developing web pages. And one of the early things that people did in web development and web design is they would do layout of their websites with tables. And that was fine when everybody was looking at your page with the same size browser. But today, you're likely to have browser in any one of a number of different sizes. So as people are using your site, what you're going to find is that they may be coming in on a large monitor. They may be coming in on a tablet. They may be coming in on a cell phone or any number of different widths. And so what we have to do is we have got to have a way that we can adjust the content, and that's what we will learn in the remainder of this is how to work with all the different properties and these different rules of layout and design. After you've created the grid in HTML, we use cascading style sheets to define things like font color, like the background color, the border color, the link colors. All of that are defined inside of the CSS, and we'll learn more about that as we go on. So the 960 grid system is a good tool for you to understand the basics of how you start laying out a web page, and we'll build from there.